Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our program, Why Teaching Diversity in Our Schools is So Important. It is hosted by the Racial Justice Subcommittee of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation at Shelter Rock in Manhasset. Our co-sponsors are Erase Racism, a Syosset nonprofit working for equity in education and housing, and LIAC, the Long Island Area Council of 11 UU congregations. I am Jim Smith, a member of the subcommittee and a Race Racism board member and a Shelter Rock delegate to LIAC. Our panelists tonight are Elaine Gross, founder and president of Erase Racism, celebrating its 20th anniversary. Elaine got her master's degree in social work from Boston University. She advocates on the local, state, and national levels for education equity and equity in housing. She publishes reports, runs conferences, and is frequently quoted on topics related to structural racism by radio and television commentators and print reporters. She works with educators, students, and parents to support and promote racially integrated schools. Elaine will discuss CRSE, Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education, which is a good companion to DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. She will also discuss critical race theory, and she will discuss the need to increase the proportion of educators of color on Long Island. Our second speaker will be Dr. Lorna Lewis, Superintendent of the Malverne School District, former Superintendent of the Plainview, Old Bethpage, and East Williston districts, and former President of the 800-member New York State Council of School Superintendents. She is an Erase Racism board member. Lorna has a bachelor's degree in physics from Fordham University, 3 master's degrees, and a doctorate in science education from Teachers College at Columbia University. Lorna will address the April 12 New York State Education Department initiative on DEI. It calls on all schools in the state to develop policies that advance diversity, equity, and inclusion as a priority. Lorna will also discuss staffing and the impact on students of learning from a diverse staff. Our third speaker will be Dr. Michael Hines, a third-year superintendent of the Port Washington School District. Hynes has put together a group of 35 teachers, administrators, students, and others for a year's work of Zoom training sessions run by the NYU Metro Center. He is beginning a 3-year equity plan for his district. Teachers in Port Washington will receive training in the benefits of culturally responsive curricula. Hynes said the aim of the plan is to improve the academic performance of students of color and level the playing field. He has a bachelor's degree in psychology from Bethany College in West Virginia, a master's in elementary education from Dowling, and got his doctorate in education administration from Dowling. He was superintendent for a total of 8 years in the Patchogue, Medford, and Shelter Island school districts. He will discuss his plans for Port Washington. The fourth speaker will be Dr. Dan Holtzman in his 5th year as principal at Great Neck North High School. Dan was also principal and an assistant principal for 11 years in Shoreham Wading River. He did his undergraduate work and received a master's in liberal arts from Stony Brook University, was certified as an administrator, and got his doctorate in educational leadership from St. John's University. He is an adjunct professor at Stony Brook University. Dan will discuss the impact of DEI on the humanities, history, social studies, and English. He is beginning a racial literacy program at Great Neck North for 11th and 12th graders. He says, we need to educate our students to be global citizens. They need to know where our society has been, where we are, and where we are going. Our students are not going to be living and working with people who look like them. Our fifth speaker will be Phill, the president of the Long Island African American Chamber of Commerce. He has been on the boards of many other nonprofits, including the Long Island Association. He has run a public relations firm for more than a decade, representing mostly nonprofits and small businesses. Andrews attended York and John Jay colleges and worked for 18 years as a corrections officer at the Rikers Island Correctional Facility. He will discuss how DEI training prepares students for a business world that is becoming increasingly diverse. I think they should teach it as early as elementary school, he says. He also added that he feels minority graduates of DEI training have a better shot at moving up the corporate ladder, which in turn might result in more support for minority businesses and customers. Our last speaker will be Shoshanna Hershkowicz, an adjunct professor at Stony Brook University. She was a high school teacher for 10 years and now is choir director at Stony Brook and is a frequent consultant to Long Island social justice nonprofits. She received a bachelor's degree in music education from SUNY Potsdam and a master's from the Crane School of Music there. She is on the executive board of the New York State chapter of the American Choral Directors Association and is an organizer with the Long Island State Action Network. She will discuss the importance of uplifting diverse voices in music programs. After the speakers, there will be a question and answer session. And now, please welcome Elaine Gross.
Good evening, everyone. I am Elaine Gross, president of Erase Racism, and it's my pleasure to be co-sponsoring this event. Thank you, Jim, for your role in organizing this forum. We are experiencing a watershed moment in our country's history. Two very different social political movements are in motion, and we, the people, will decide which movement will prevail. One movement is reflected in the actions of New York State educational leaders who have acknowledged that the teaching provided for our students could be significantly enhanced by embracing the culturally responsive sustaining education framework, or CRSE, published by the New York State Education Department, NYSED, in 2018. Further, a second document, the New York State Board of Regents Framework on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in New York's Schools, a call to action, was published, and NYSED approved a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, or DEI, policy statement in May 2021. This new policy requires that all school districts develop and implement diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. Dr. Lewis will talk about this new policy, and Dr. Hynes will talk about implementing CRSE. These documents are available on NYSED's website, and they boldly assert that race matters. Here are 5 takeaways. Every aspect of education in New York State must be evaluated through an equity and inclusion lens in our schools and in the work of the regents and NYSED. No group of students is inherently bad or inferior. We must acknowledge that racial diversity is New York's reality and will be the future reality of our state and our country. We should all celebrate that diversity. The diversity must be represented in all areas of education, including teachers' lessons plans and the way they implement them, and in the school staff, most especially the teachers and administrators. We must respond to documented disparities in educational resources, opportunities, and outcomes, which require that we acknowledge the impact of systemic racism on New York's students. Don't just look at the symptoms of systemic racism, but look at policies that continually reproduce those persistent disparities. We must tell the truth about racism and bigotry, both in our history and in current events. Concerning increasing the diversity of educators, as you can see from this slide, the need can be seen in this chart. In 2019, over 90% of Long Island's teachers were white, even though white students made up only 50% of the student population. The Regent's prioritization of DEI and CRSE is consistent with a body of research that uniformly emphasizes their benefits on students of all races. Students of color are more engaged when educators and curricula reflect their backgrounds. Both they and white students do better academically. Let me add that these documents look at equity issues affecting a broad spectrum of the student population, regardless of their racial and ethnic identity, family economic circumstance, disability, age, gender identity, sexual orientation, and religion. Before I discuss the other movement, which is on a collision course with what I have just described, I need to share some background for understanding why race matters. For several centuries, the concept of race was constructed, consciously and unconsciously, in the minds of prominent individuals that held power. They were landowners and owners of enslaved Africans, government officials, religious leaders, judges, and the like, all white Europeans. In the 1800s, so-called scientific investigations were confirming a common understanding of race. Yes, we now know that what we refer to as race is not based on blood, brain sizes, or other so-called biological factors that manifest outwardly in skin color. Scientists from various fields have agreed that there is no race gene, and people within the same race have been found to have more genetic differences than people from different racial groups. But race is real in its consequences. The hierarchy that arises from this pseudoscientific and common understanding of race allowed people to justify chattel slavery. Africans were meant to be slaves because they were fundamentally inferior to white people. In fact, they were not fully human. In contrast, white people were destined to be at the top of the hierarchy. So when we talk about systemic racism, we are talking about that white supremacy narrative, which started long ago, but reinvents itself over time, even now. Now let's talk about that other movement, the anti-CRT movement, CRT standing for critical race theory. 8 states have passed legislation and another 20 are considering it to require that educators avoid teaching about the role of racism and oppression in American history. While the legislation is new, America long has suppressed some of the truth about race relations. Why is such censorship so politically appealing at a time when the truth is both readily apparent and so much more accessible. That is what I wrote in a recent opinion article that was published in the national news outlet, The Hill. So what is CRT? It is a legal framework for lawyers and law students to understand how racism shapes the legal system and how the legal system in turn perpetuates racism. What are the proponents of these anti-CRT bills and laws saying? They claim that teachers in K through 12 are teaching CRT, when in reality, teachers are trying to adhere to CRSE. Anti-CRT proponents are using vague language that effectively requires teachers to avoid teaching the truth about the factual role of racism and oppression throughout US history. For some of the laws and pending bills, to steer clear of any adverse legal action against themselves, educators could safely only talk about subjects in a way that does not make a student feel any negative emotion, like discomfort, that they could attribute to their race. If a student or their parent state that a child felt discomfort during a lesson, the teacher could be deemed guilty without much recourse. How, after all, could a teacher prove that a student did not feel discomfort? What is really the objective of these anti-CRT bills and laws? The politicians want to stop any talk of racism in America. This will prevent the implementation of CRSE. The white supremacy narrative is reinventing itself once again. Our children shouldn't learn about the Tulsa race massacre, they say, because it shows our country in a bad light. By the way, others challenge the facts altogether. For instance, slavery wasn't really that bad. And it is not just the past that is doubted. For the current manifestation of systemic racism in education, healthcare, access to credit, the deaths of Black and brown boys and girls at the hands of police, they argue that there is no need to take action on any of these issues because the disparities experienced by Black and brown people, including the children, don't truly exist. They say white people are the real victims that need protection. This year, in a New Yorker article, Christopher Rufo, an activist who launched this anti-CRT crusade, said, and I quote, "Critical race theory is the perfect villain. Conservatives need to wake up. This is an existential threat to the United States, and the bureaucracy, even under Trump, is being weaponized against core American values," close quote. But many students understand that core American values mean acknowledging the reality of systemic racism and working towards a more just future. Youths from our student task force repeatedly talk about the need for their curricula and educators to be more culturally responsive. So our movement to advance CRSE and DEI and to teach children the truth supports their growth as citizens and is critical to the health of our democracy. So when I say we, I hope that that includes all of you who are participating on this forum this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Now we'll hear from Dr. Lorna Lewis.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for including me in this important conversation. This conversation is happening statewide and also across the country. I'll begin with a little bit of data because I'm known for looking at data. In 2014, this nation's public schools moved from a white majority to a minority. In New York State, if you look at our population since 1990 to today, we will notice that we have a very diverse population. We are less than, in fact, in 2019, it was 43% white. And that number is even lower. And what we notice is that we have a growing number of various cultures. In fact, some districts will say that they have 53 different languages spoken. In my district, we will have 5 or 6. But the one thing we note, there isn't a single district in New York State that is monolithic. That we are, and the trajectory is that we are going to become more and more diverse. And so if we continue to instruct in the way that we did in the 1950s, because our schools were actually established along the factory model, and that everybody would get the same thing. And what we did was we provided equal education post 60s. We have to recognize the growing diversity in New York State and provide access to education for all students. So when we talk about DEI, the first thing we're going to do is recognize that we have a very diverse population, diverse not just in race, but in religion, in various factors, and that what we do in our schools must embrace that diversity. And we must embrace it in very welcoming ways. So when the D in DEI is recognizing that that children will need very differentiated resources because they have diverse needs. That's the D. When we have the E, which is the equity, that doesn't mean that we give the same thing for everyone. We have to recognize that different children will need different resources, that's the diversity, in order to arrive at success. Because when we say success, we mean success for all. So we have to find out ways in which we're going to provide, and not an equal education, but an equitable opportunities for students. And inclusion is about providing a welcoming environment. So the DEI framework that the state has created speaks to actually 4 tenets. It's having high expectation for all students, providing a welcoming and affirming environment for all students. So we have to look at ways that we will provide that. And in fact, what the state has done is provided us with a framework that says it begins with the Board of Education, establishing a policy for establishing those expectations for a welcoming and affirming environment, for having curriculum that addresses the various needs of students. So if you have, for example, if you have students who have disabilities, you naturally wouldn't question creating a curriculum that will address their disabilities. We would have to have a curriculum that reflects the needs of students, which means that we don't leave certain parts of history. I always say we don't do a la carte history. So when we look at our social studies curriculum, it is one of inclusion. And if we look at our literature has to include, it cannot be that the literature that we're looking at today in our schools would be the same literature that we looked at back in the 50s or the 60s. We need to have authors that reflect the population. So we look in our schools, and I know that Malverne does that, we look at having the literature and our social studies reflecting what our populations or what the actual world is. So if we're looking at our libraries, we want to make sure that our children see themselves from kindergarten all the way through 12, they see themselves in the materials that we choose. So the state framework demands that we do that. We also, in the framework, it demands that we provide professional development for our teachers so that they understand, and of course the resources, so they understand what it is to be in an inclusive environment, and they have the resources to do that. So it was really important that the state came out and did what they did in terms of establishing through boards of education, because without that mandate, nothing really gets moved. So they, NYSBA, which is our New York State's School Boards Association, has put out sample policies that reflect the framework that the state has put out. And it really is a very, it's very instructive. And so I would encourage anybody who's looking on to get a sample of the NYSBA policy, which includes eliminating disruptive systemic inequalities, inequities, ensuring systemic equity. So that one of the things that's under that is intentionally that we create an environment where we intentionally seek and include voices, student voices, in even down to where we're talking about student government and in leadership roles in our schools. It also talks about ensuring that your building is welcoming and inclusive to all who enter. So it may be that you, through the board policy, you're looking at your registration when people come to your district who are different from who you expect you have in your population, that you have languages, you have the documents in different languages, that you have you provide a space and a brave space for them to be able to access the application forms for registration. So those are the kinds of things that you want to look at. And do a review of your existing policy to make sure, it requires that we do a review of our existing policy to make sure that programs, professional development, and procedures promote equity. So now you say, and also looking at the way we measure and use data. So the question one would say is, why do we need to do that? Well, if you look at the data that Elaine put forward at the very beginning, it's something that I use all the time, because when we look at our teaching staff isn't very changed from the 1980s, even though our student population has dramatically changed. We do not have a teaching staff that reflects our student population. And so you may say to yourself, well, why do you need that? Research shows that when a Black boy has a Black teacher in the third grade, starting in the third grade or even before, but definitely the research is from third grade, that one experience of having a teacher of their same race has a long-term effect on their success. You have Latinx students who go through school who never see a teacher of their same race, African-American students. Even though our population has moved from a majority white population to a majority other population. I don't want to say minority, but we have Black, Latinx, Indian, Asian populations in our schools, but we have not deliberately gone after a recruitment process that would change our staffing makeup. And this framework invites us to take that seriously, provides data that shows that it is important that we do that. It also requires us to implement an equity lens in everything that we do so that we're intentionally inclusive in what we do in our decision-making in our schools. We have to have very clear goals when the boards of education meet, and most boards of education have put out their goals by October. There should be a goal included in every, in the goal to address inclusion, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I know that we're going to have lots of questions regarding that. And I hope that I have presented some kind of a background as to what the state has required us to do. I just want to reinforce the fact that any district who has not started working on their policies that is reflective of the framework needs to get started working on that, because the policies, as we know, drive the work we do in schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorna. And now our third speaker is Dr. Michael Hines.
Thank you, Jim. And before I begin, thank you, Dr. Lewis, of course, for your words of wisdom. Elaine Gross, your words of wisdom and inspiration, for sure. And the Unitarian Universalist congregation at Shelter Rock, thank you for this opportunity, along with the racism. I'm going to try to condense a lot into a short period of time, because I know we have a lot of panelists here. But I think it's important with my work in Port Washington, have a very progressive Board of Education. And, and it's actually nice to actually speak about something that's not COVID related, to be honest with you. And I can't think of anything more important right now than this conversation. So let me go back to last year, because I know Dr. Lewis framed and spoke about board goals, because within a school organization, it is incredibly important that the school community understands what the board's expectations are and what they would like to see. So I will go back to last year in our work, and we had several goals, like most boards do, but two of them had to do with encouraging a learning environment and curriculum that will work to close not only the achievement, but the opportunity gap by giving equal access and to erase inequalities for all students. And then also to develop hiring policies and to encourage recruitment from a variety of resources that ensures that we have a highly not only qualified, but a diverse staff that is reflective of the population that we serve. And when I talk about the population we serve here in Port Washington, we hear the word diverse often, and Dr. Lewis referenced it's not just race and ethnicity, it's socioeconomic status, it's a whole litany of things. And that's really important, that the school district is really a microcosm of the community at large as far as what they're doing internally. So with that, when we talked about part of the goals, one of the outgrowths of that was to develop and create a diversity, equity, and inclusion task force, which we did last year, which was no easy feat. Again, if you think about going back to what last year looked like, but again, it was so important for the Board of Education to move this forward. We did, and we moved forward in January. And what we ended up doing, I know Ms. Gross referenced from the New York State Education Department, the culturally responsive sustaining education framework. We had to become, I think, reacquainted with that. And when you do become acquainted with that document, you realize, well, not only was Ms. Gross part of the putting together of that document, but so was New York University Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and Transformation of Schools, or New York Metro, as we like to make it a little bit shorter. And with that, they've been working for many years, working with school districts to really focus on these sort of things. And so what we ended up doing was partnering with them beginning last year, which was really, really exciting. And I have to say, very, very illuminating in many different ways. And if you go to their website, what they really talk about, they focus on a whole host of things. A few of them are professional development, technical assistance, being consultancy to education institutions like ours in general, and then focusing on advancing equity. And I know Dr. Lewis really set forth a common language of what equity means. So what we ended up doing when we partnered with NYU Metro, we're working with the director, which is facilitated by Dr. Maria Hernandez and Mr. Reed Sweer, who's amazing. And they've been doing this for a while, as I said before. And part of what we had to do was to look at a cross section of our school community, and both internally and externally. So, to make sure that certainly we have people who, work for the school district, but people who are also part of the school district in multiple capacities. So we have myself, we have my cabinet with Dr. Shields, Chris Shields, who's amazing. He's really spearheading this with me. In district office, we have Board of Ed trustees on this committee. 5 administrators, 7 teachers, multiple staff members in different capacities, community members. I think we have 8, I believe, and then we have 5 students initially starting off. And as you can imagine, we had to define what our objectives were, at least for this year, looking at February, as we put this together in January, as I said, and then figuring out where hopefully we would be in June. And basically what NYU helped us really focus on was developing a common understanding of what disproportionality means, where it lives, why it lives there, and to understand the root causes of such things. And just as important, developing solutions for what that actually means. So we had to, and we did discuss the root cause process, and then figuring out a strategic 5-year plan, which we are almost finished with, by the way, which has been a lot of work to develop, like I said, a multi-year plan to really tackle this. And with that, the way that the U.S. Department of Education really frames out and defines what disproportionality is an overrepresentation of a specific group in special education programs or disciplinary outcomes relative to the presence of the group in the overall student population, and or the underrepresentation of a specific group in accessing intervention services, resources, programs. What's really important to all of us, which is a rigorous curriculum and instruction relative to the presence of this group in the overall student population. So what does this actually mean? Well, if one delves into the district's code of conduct, if we look at our policies, which define and help us focus on things as far as our operating system within the school district, when was the last time a district actually did a deep dive into those things? So before we did that, what we ended up doing as a group, or groups plural, was to read 2 books, White Fragility and How to Be Anti-Racist, which was incredibly illuminating in many ways. We had discussions about such books and what our thoughts were surrounding that. We also read several articles and research papers because many of us were coming from all different places. In as much as I'm working in Port Washington now, I started off as a teacher in Bellport in South Country School District, which I love tremendously. And if you know anything about Bellport in the South Country School District, you literally have the tracks dividing certain populations of that school community. And so you get to really understand from a different perspective what goes on and why it goes on. And so when you move through different systems on Long Island, which I believe is the 2nd or the 3rd most segregated place, maybe in some places it's even number 1. Why hasn't that changed? And what are the anticipated and unanticipated consequences of such things? But again, I digress. Let me talk about the things that we did. Our teams unpacked and discussed at the building and district level our academic data, looking at subgroups. One of the first things I noticed in Port Washington, and again, it's an incredibly affluent school district. It's a very high performing school district, but when you get into the weeds, as I know Lorna does with data, which I totally appreciate, you look at our subgroups, if our overall graduation rate is 94, 95%, which it shouldn't be, it should be 100%. You look at the subgroups, and it's not even close to that. So if you look at our African-American population or Latinx population, students with disabilities or Ls, how are they faring? not 5-year cohort data, but 4-year. They're not doing nearly as well. And again, as I said before, looking at our code of conduct, looking at referral forms, suspensions, there's an overrepresentation of a smaller population that seems to be there. And again, we have to ask why that is. And more important, what are we going to do about it? So we've been looking at qualitative and quantitative data. And as I said before, looking at, and we have been focusing on developing a 5-year plan. Now this year, with our Board of Education, we have several goals as district goals. We fused superintendent and board goals this year. And goal number 3 has to do with increasing graduation rates overall by subgroups. That's great news. I'm happy to hear that. We should always be focusing on that. But we also have to identify and support student needs at all levels and reduce disproportionality in behavioral and disciplinary referrals, and to come up with benchmarks and a concrete plan for doing so. We are revising and reviewing our code of conduct this year in year 1, which we will have our plan ready to share with the board, I'm hoping by the end of October, hopefully early November, the latest. And I think, as Lorna said before, professional development is incredibly important as you try to move within a system and to change a system. Listen, it's hard enough to change your own mind, right? But when you try to change a system and you try to change collective mindsets and practices of the way things have been going on forever. When you look at some board policies that haven't been changed since Reagan was in the White House. So to try to change the way that you go about your business and what your focal points will be, it's a massive movement. It's a massive change, but if it's a priority for any school district, you make that happen. And that's what we're looking forward to doing.
Thank you very much, Michael. And our 4th presenter will be Dr. Dan Holtzman.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for having me as part of this evening's event. It's an honor to be a part of this part of the powerhouse panelists that are with us this evening. So thank you. I'm more of a visual person, so that's why I have the slides up. I sort of freaked out some of the panelists before with indicating that I had a presentation. So I'm going in a different direction with this conversation. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to focus on that delve into the humanities element, but also focus in on sort of the culture and climate that we create within the scope of our respective classrooms and schools. Many of the things that I'm going to mention, we have either already thought about or perhaps have already been implemented. And we're always looking for ways to continue on a path and a trajectory of growth. So we always ask, and I'm sure this is one of the questions that Mike and Lorna have asked numerous times in the past in their positions, is at the core of what are we at the core? Who are we and what do we stand for as schools, communities, and educators? Because in order to make any real systemic changes, you need to have that focus. You need to know who you are and what you want for your students and your schools and your communities. And I think that, one of the things that has resonated and continues to resonate is that since the 1840s, our goal has always been to create better citizens. I mean, that was the point of creating public schools. And this continues to evolve. Just as everything around us continues to evolve, we have to continue to evolve as educators and as schools. At its core, education begins and ends with relationships. Students need to feel valued. Students need to have a sense of dignity. Students need to have a sense of acceptance. Students need to feel as though they're being treated fairly. And in some respects, that treated fairly means different things in different circumstances. Dignity and respect are two different things. Dignity is unconditional and respect is in the control of the person that gives that respect. So we have to have a mindset, this equity mindset in our practices, in our philosophy, and our approach to education that touches upon the importance of this inclusivity, this equity, and this diversity that exists, even in the face of schools that may not be diverse. And there are schools on the island and throughout the state that aren't considered to be particularly diverse. But the question becomes, how do you then implement and create a policy and a practice, educational practices within your scope of your school if it's not. And even if it is, how do you create those practices and policies that touch upon the importance of culture and relationships with teachers and relationships with peers, and an overall sense that there is this acceptance and understanding of who our students are. They're not just 14, 15, 16-year-old learners. They have experiences, and they all have different experiences. They're varied lived and cultural experiences. And many of those experiences play out in the classroom. Many of them, as Mike was illustrating before, likely with the discipline, play out in that respect because their experiences are different than that of someone else. So what's going on at home, what's going on in their respective community, what's going on in their lives helps to dictate behavior and a focus on school and a focus on whether or not I can trust or whether or not I want to form relationships. And then their response in kind revolves around that particular lived experience. So when we look at an equity growth mindset, kind of focusing on Dweck's work a little bit, but when we talk about the equity growth mindset, we have to be reflective. What are we doing? What are we doing that's working? And we have to be mindful and accepting of things that we do that may have worked at one point that may not be working now. And we have to be able to move away from the mentality of, well, this is how I've done it, and everyone around me needs to adjust. Like everyone needs to adjust to my teaching style. Everyone needs to adjust to the way I assess. Everyone needs to adjust to my personality traits. It's the other way around. We have to adjust to our students. We have 5 classes a day, 30 students per class if you're in a high school. Not every class can be treated or approached in the same way. Even if you're only teaching Global 9, let's say, or English 10, if that's your prep for the day, each class is different. You can't expect to walk into a particular class with a lesson plan and expect to execute it the same way for different groups of students. So we need to sort of have that mindset that we need to look at each class differently. We need to approach each student differently. We have to recognize that while they may be smiling at us and be friendly and personable, there's a whole host of other factors coming into that child's life that we might be aware of. And one of the things that students need to feel, and when we talk about the disenfranchised, when we talk about the students that are quote unquote disconnected from school, is it because they don't feel like somebody? Is it because we haven't taken the time? Is it because we're focusing on students who might have a stronger sense, a stronger academic sense? Is it because we don't feel like we have the time to be able to slow the pace down, kind of pivot the way in which we are approaching curriculum to meet those needs of all of our learners? And remember, culture is multiple aspects of identity. We've mentioned it before that it comes from several different areas: its strengths, needs, goals, perspectives, and that shared life experience. So in terms of curriculum and resources, what does the research tell us? The research tells us that when there's underrepresented groups in our schools, they find the coursework to be alienating, irrelevant, or disconnecting between what their lived reality is and what we're teaching. So one of the critical points to looking at DEI is to recognize that. And what can we do to enhance the curriculum? What can we do to enhance discussions? What kinds of questions can we present? What kinds of activities can we create? What kind of research-oriented activities can we ask students to engage in that not only produce productive conversation, but also bring about a reality that they themselves may not have realized existed? Because when you live in your own life, when you live in your own world, you don't always recognize what goes on outside the scope of your own world. And as schools and as communities, we have a multitude of differences that exist, whether it is socioeconomic, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's religion, whatever it happens to be. We have to acknowledge that and recognize and not only accept, but show dignity. It's like going from safe space to brave space, brave space. It's not just about respect and tolerance. It's about the dignity, and it's about being valued, and it's about the relationships. So when we look at our programming, when we reassess, whether it's Dr. Hynes looking at a 5-year plan or just looking at current curriculum, we have to look to see, are we meeting needs of all learners at all abilities where they are and where they're coming from. We don't generally talk about where they're coming from. We want to meet students where they are. But how do we know where they are if we don't know where they came from? If we don't know their past, if we don't know them intimately in that respect, how can we establish a game plan, a process for getting students to, whether we're focusing on a Regents exam or an AP exam or not, the bottom line is that we want to see them graduate. We want to see them have the skills that are necessary in order for them to compete in a global society. We want them to be able to interact and form relationships in a diverse society, one that may not necessarily look like the school or community in which they live. So curriculum could realign to expose students to teachers to historical events, time periods, people, et cetera, that were integral in shaping who we are on a local, state, and national level, to legitimize our shared history. Because regardless of where we come from, we do have a shared history. We are Americans. We are in the United States, and if we've got students who aren't necessarily U.S. Citizens just yet, they're in the process of doing so, there's still a shared history because they're here, and they need to be exposed to who we are, who they are, and the directions in which we're all heading. So if we look at things like emotional intelligence strategies for teachers, they can create a blueprint. They can look at a sort of a self-analysis of, where do we need to continue to grow, where do we want to grow, and where do we need to pivot. And these are conversations that I think likely have been happening for years, but it's a question of now there's a real there's a true finish line here. There's a goal in mind where we want to ensure that the curriculum that we teach and the curriculum that students are learning fits in with everybody that's in your respective classrooms. So that self-analysis and having that self-reflection about the work that we do and the areas in which we need to grow is critical. So through this reflection and intentionality and purpose, we can provide students with exposure to nuances of our country's history in a myriad of approaches. We all know the critical lenses of ELA. We know that we tie those into social studies as well. But these are just some examples. For ELA, there's the incorporation of a number of different texts that are historical in nature, that touch on diversity, that touch on inclusivity, and we can connect with outside groups as well that help guide us, that can help us access these resources, whether they're historical speeches, poems, music lyrics, whatever it happens to be. But we use these lenses to analyze and pull out information and insights that we might not have necessarily looked at before, because we're following a scope and sequence that didn't necessarily focus on that. So it's something that we can look at, and using a Socratic approach as an example can provide that opportunity for that insightful dialogue. In social studies, aside from the curriculum, there's a myriad of organizations that schools, classes, students, teachers, whether it's formal or informal, can partner with, that can provide a number of these resources and guidance for students and teachers to gain a greater knowledge and understanding of the world around them. And these are just a few that I was able to come up with, but obviously there's more than that. But you've got Erase Racism as a whole, Museum of Jewish Heritage, Holocaust Tolerance, Facing History, Project 1619, the New York Historical Society, the 9/11 Museum, et cetera. The list goes on and on. So there are things that are accessible and available to us that we could use that don't necessarily require us to sort of abandon what we're doing. We're looking at taking steps to incorporate and enhance our current curriculum so that students are exposed to different perspectives and insights. So having an inclusive curriculum, I think Dr. Lewis mentioned it before about using the inclusion of current events. Student input on topics of unit of study, having a diverse canon of resources. As an example, looking at more inclusive and representative looks of Black soldiers in the defense of our nation. The Lavender Scare of 1950s that targeted LGBTQ government officials. Rosa Parks is a civil rights advocate, not just somebody who wouldn't give up their seat on the bus. contributions of the LGBTQ historical figures. There's more to it that we can incorporate on our own to enhance this. And again, this is an opportunity to enhance the landscape and curriculum and our educational practices. So something I want to sort of end with, I think it kind of gives you a sense of where we are in our education world and where we need to be. So the story of the streetlight effect essentially is a man is looking for his keys under a streetlight, and he's looking for them. He's looking at them. Policeman asks him, "What are you looking for?" And he says, "I'm looking for my keys." And policeman asks, "Did you lose them here?" And he says, "No, I lost them in the park." The policeman says, "Why are you searching here?" And he says, "Well, this is where the light is." So humanities professors use this as a justification for sort of reading between the lines, to look at the available light, to speculate what might lie in the darkness. This is something that is lying in the darkness. This is something that we need to shed some light on and have conversation about. If communities and districts elect not to move in this direction, I think it should be because the conversation was had and perspectives and input were shared, and not because we want to focus where the light is. I think we need to look beyond and try to expose our students and our communities to other opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. And now we'll hear from our fifth speaker, Phill Andrews.
Okay, good evening. I'm going to start with the premise that diversity, equity, and inclusion can be taught, but it should be lived. I believe that we need to develop a pipeline throughout elementary school, junior high, high school, career, and it become part of the American system. But one of the things that I believe is if we can teach them at an early age and get them into the laboratories and prepare them to be doctors, diversity, equity, and inclusion should be the same. And I would also like to give reference to the book, The Stone Soup, how we teach kids leadership at a very early age. And that book today has influenced many leaders, how they get people to work together. So it should be a lifelong learning thing. It should integrate just like we integrate things around discrimination, racism. We should really fully try to integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the best ways to do it, I believe, is to start with young people throughout their lives early, because the longer that we have to work with something, the more better we get at it, and to really integrate it where it becomes second nature. Many people kind of reference this concept of systematic institution. Well, we can do the same thing with diversity, equity, and inclusion if we start early, because we also have to be the model for the young people, but we should also be teaching them that very early, because all the sayings, even a doctor, when he starts in the laboratory in a hospital settings early, he has better bedside manners. So my main premise is let's get it in the schools early and teach it where it becomes part of our early foundation. And as most educators know, the things that we get early, young people become who they are very early on in lives. So we need to start teaching it very early throughout the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phill. And now our last presenter will be Shoshanna Hershkowicz.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone who has been here tonight. I appreciate you all sticking around. And I have to say how absolutely honored I am to be sitting on a panel of such distinguished educational leaders on Long Island, some of whom I've met in person, some of whom I've only had the pleasure of hearing speak at different conferences and events. So the spin that I want to put on this is one coming from arts education, which is certainly aligned with the humanities that you heard from Dr. Holtzman, and also from the perspective, the microcosm. A lot of the folks on this call are in executive positions. They're seeing this from a macro level, from a superintendent's level, from a principal's level, where you're really overseeing hundreds and hundreds of educators within a system. And I just want to talk a little bit about what does it look like in one person's classroom? How do you structure this type of work in your little space so that it can become exactly what we're talking about here, this brave space? And I will say the first thing that has to happen, I think for most of us in the classroom, is we have to do some unlearning. And I think it is because, and I'll speak from my own perspective as someone who is classically trained. I think that the default in music education is that Western European music as what is the norm, what is the standard. So I think when we approach it from that perspective, and certainly it is a valuable perspective, and Mozart is eating your musical vegetables, and it's delicious. But I think that there are times in our focus solely on Western music and in teaching through that vein that we may lose students or not recognize the inherent gifts they bring to the table because they may not present in that traditional model that we've always said is what we consider excellent. The kid who can make all county or all state, or, did a NISMA solo, or is going to major in music in college, and one thing I've had to really consider is that we also, when we think about who winds up excelling, it often has to do with resources. And particularly in the arts, when you think about, who are the kids who are going into this, who are getting these accolades, they're often students who have the resources to rent an instrument, to take private lessons, to do all the things that can advance you to the next place. And then when we think about what is the admissions process into college, so who are going to be our future musicians, our future music educators, so often that audition process is the kind of thing where we're talking, again, what are the expectations in an audition? It's classical repertoire, which of course is important and you have to know. But if we're saying that like gospel music or musical theater or folk music can't be audition material on the same way that a Mozart aria or a French art song can be, then again, who are we losing in this process? And if that's who we're sending into, let's say, a music education institution like I went to, like up at Potsdam, then we are, again, the pool gets narrower and narrower. And if that's the lens through which we get into the field and train in the field and then go do our pre-service work, then who's going into the classroom and how are we teaching? So I think that we have to do, whether we call it unlearning or expanding our horizons of learning, we as educators have to be willing to open those doors and to say like, hey, the lens through which I learned things is perhaps an incomplete one and I have work to do. I have some things to really unpack. And I know that in the beginning of a career, that can be really hard to do when you're just dealing with things like classroom management and paperwork, and particularly young teachers right now. I spent several years supervising pre-service teachers and their student teaching, just trying to handle student teaching and early teaching in the time of COVID is incredibly difficult. So I think that these are not necessarily, unless we incorporate this into collegiate pre-service teaching for the future educators, it's going to be, and I think we should, but I think it's going to be a challenge for superintendents and principals to get their teachers to work on this sort of thing early on. And I do think it has to happen earlier rather than later, because it's real easy to get set in your ways and become complacent. So some of what I had to learn was to look for these gifts in my students that didn't always present in the ways that I had been taught were excellence. And to recognize that my version of excellence and what I had been taught was the traditional version was incomplete. And when I came to the point that I truly understood that is when I could become the teacher I needed to be for my classroom. And particularly now, my first 10 years were spent at Comac High School, which is a predominantly white school. So these weren't questions I had to ask myself. And when I went to Stony Brook University, which is a very diverse place, has a lot of first generation students, has a lot of international students for whom English is not their first language, I had to evaluate who I am and what I do and how I do it. And there's some discomfort in that work. And I think that you have to be ready to be uncomfortable to do this. Because out of that discomfort, I think comes growth. And I think we're better educators and better at our craft. And I think we provide a brave space. So for me, I think this divergence of the political action and social action work that I do outside of the classroom has certainly informed how I think about what I'm doing in the classroom. And it has changed the way I program. I think that I really spend quite a bit of time now thinking about how the repertoire can shape the discussions we have in class, that who I'm programming. I believe it was Dr. Lewis said, we want our students to see themselves reflected in the music, for me, in the music that they study and that we perform. So I'd say over the last few years, I have really focused that alongside, who I lovingly refer to like my dead guys, my Mozart, my Vivaldi, my Bach, who are staples of the literature, alongside them, not replacing them. No one's canceling Mozart. We're making sure that we're programming LGBTQ composers, composers of color, Latinx composers, indigenous composers, women composers, because that is so often underrepresented in the classical music world. And along with that, and I think part of the reason I love choral music is that it's this marriage of music and text. So I get to really do a deep dive into poetry and into subjects that are like really get kind of heavy. We, in the last couple of years, did a section from the oratorio considering Matthew Shepard, which was, about the death of Matthew Shepard by an LGBTQ composer. This semester, which is our first semester back in person, we're working on music. We're doing a piece called Say Her Name, which really dives deep into the Black Lives Matter movement and says the names, and one of the things I'm doing with my students to really get them is they're doing the research on the name they choose to say. So, and we've started to talk about like, do we want to add some names? And, a student said, I want to talk about Daniel Prude because I'm from upstate New York and this happened in my town and I feel like I have to say that name and tell that story. So not only presenting the material, but letting our students take ownership of that process and of the storytelling. And, we're doing a piece by a transgender composer who is going to be speaking with my class, and the poems come from the children's poet laureate, J. Patrick Lewis. It's a book of civil rights poems, and it's called When Thunder Comes. And again, I think that the more my students see themselves reflected in the music we study, whether it is the text, whether it's the compositions, and the more we can say, this is a place where we can unpack some of this stuff and have difficult conversations. And I'll give you a quick microcosm. A couple of years back, pre-pandemic, the last concert I did, we did a piece from apartheid South Africa, really beautiful, beautiful piece. And the South African choral music is just some of the most beautiful, incredible stuff you'll ever hear. And we use that as not only an opportunity to think about sound and tone and all of the things I would do in any piece of music, but we used it to study culture and context. So we read some excerpts from Nelson Mandela's writings. We also grabbed Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime, and we went through his definition of apartheid. And then we watched South African choirs of the present day singing this music. And the fact that it is these, young singers, black and white, singing this music together, which obviously 40 years ago when this music, 50 years ago when this was written, was inconceivable. Putting that together right there and having my students witness students their age singing this music and saying, all right, what does this mean? And how is this music a point of reflecting on where this culture has been and being a mechanism for reconciliation? And we had some big conversations in our room about what would reconciliation look like in the United States. And I imagine that conversation would look different 2 years later. And also we had some tricky questions. I had a student raise their hand and say, is it cultural appropriation if we use the gestures that this choir is using? And we got into a pretty heavy conversation about what is or isn't cultural appropriation and how do you make those choices as an artist, and what is doing the work so that it's not cultural appropriation. And those are big, heavy, brave conversations. And I think that is the future of education. And the truth is that I don't think our students will accept less from us anymore because their access to information, they know too much for us to do too little. And I think that it is a really challenging time to be a teacher, but it is such a rewarding one because we can go to places that no one dared imagine or dream even 10 or 15 years ago. And I am so grateful to be in the arts and to be in this field where I get to marry music and text and not only challenge my students, but have them challenge me to be a better global citizen. And I think it's an incredible privilege to do this work and to bring, I don't think it's just diversity, equity, and inclusion. A dear colleague of mine, Derek Fox, Dr. Derek Fox out in Nebraska, said it's also access and belonging. And I think that those need to be included in our goals of DEI. And I believe I'm the last speaker, so I would be happy to turn it over to the whole group and to take questions.
Thank you very much, Shoshanna. Before we continue, I'd just like to express our condolences for a family member of Phill Andrews, one of our panelists. And thank Phill for showing up to take part in the difficult circumstances. And I'd like to say that I feel honored that to hear some of the cutting edge philosophies in Long Island education today. I wish we had 1,000 people on this webinar. I'm going to ask either Dan or Michael to respond to a question from Catherine Abatello, and I'll be paraphrasing the questions. How do you convince the Board of Ed in a mostly white district of the importance of DEI?
So this is recorded, right, Jim?
Yes, sir.
I say that tongue in cheek, but I say that because I hope it is, and I'm glad it is. Well, listen, the fact that you have to potentially try to change or try to convince a board or some board members that this work is important is borderline frightening. But if you do, I look at it this way. And you hear this all the time, right? You know, these cliche sayings, a rising tide lifts all ships. I could think of several more. But the bottom line is, if you want your system to be the best that it can be, it's incredibly important that you serve all of the students that are there in all its glory, in the spectrum of what a student is and what supports they may need, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, religion, all the different groups that we categorize kids in. If you want your system to be world-class, then you don't have a choice than to embark on this incredibly important journey. And, you know, again, not just because the state's saying it, which, as Dr. Lewis said, is important. It's helpful. You can hang your hat on it as a superintendent or as a community member saying you have to do this. But the reality is, I think the system as a whole will not reach its fullest potential unless it embarks on this type of work. And if there's anybody out there with the 94 attendees who are watching at least live right now, if they ever want to email me, I'd be more than happy to unpack that a little bit more. I don't want to take up too much more time. But this should be priority one for everybody. Aside from the health and safety of how our students are when they're within our school and our staff, this should be it.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from Susan Goddard. And I'll throw this out to whoever would like to answer. What advice would you give parents who have formed DEI committees in their districts, but are hitting a stone wall and hostility from their administrations?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Dr. Lewis is still there. I'm assuming she is. And And I don't, listen, I don't mind taking a stab at this, but I'm sure with her incredible experience, she can certainly answer it much better than I can.
Go ahead, Lorna.
Well, thank you. I think it's important that parents work with their administration. So if you have an independent committee, I think it's important that you work with your administration to do any committee. So a DEI committee, I cannot imagine a DEI committee happening without a partnership with the administration. So if you're in the PTA, then the PTA, if it's for a particular building that they would want to work through the New York State PTA to help, because there are resources with the PTA that, in fact, I have the document that the New York State PTA has, which is a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Kyle Belakapitsky is a wonderful executive director who would provide the parent body with the resources. And they have a wonderful document with lots of resources on how to address the DEI within the parent body. But I would say it is impossible to really bring to fruition something just with the parent body alone, that I would encourage that person to work with some administration and have the PTA, New York State PTA, help them to resource that access.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to direct this one to Dan. Aren't teachers hamstrung by Regents exam graduation requirements, the need to cover the material that will be on the Regents? So even if they want to take a detour and explore a topic not usually covered, they might have to rein themselves in because it's not going to be on the Regents.
Yeah, I know that argument fairly well, not just because of anything dealing with this particular topic, but just in terms of going into curriculum a bit more deeper. I've always believed that the curriculum is a guide. So if you're staying within the confines of the guide, you should feel as though that there is flexibility in as deep as you want to go in certain aspects of certain topics, certain amount of time you want to spend. And I think that when you teach more deeply than things that go beyond the scope of a Regents exam, the exam, I think, takes care of itself. So I think when we focus too much time on the test and we teach something because it's quote unquote on the test, I think that diminishes the learning experience for students. I think the motivation to learn, the appreciation of the learning sometimes can get lost and does get lost because if I'm only learning this because you're testing me on it, or there's a larger assessment at the end of the year for which I have to pass, there needs to be more to the learning experience for students at all ages than simply that because it's on the test. When you say that, or when a student, I've been in classrooms where the opposite has happened, where a student has asked a question and the teacher will say, they'll answer it briefly, but say, you don't need to know that, it's not on the test. Well, if the student's asking an inquisitive question, why not take the time and have a conversation about it, regardless of whether that's going to be assessed or not? The end result of assessment shouldn't be because that's what the student had to learn. There needs to be more to the learning experience.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to address this one to Elaine Gross, please. And it's coming from a ringer, the social justice coordinator of LIAC, Mary Beth Gweither. And she asks, shouldn't the more important question be how we address diversity where we live? The de facto segregation of racial and ethnic groups undermines the acceptance of diversity in our schools.
Well, it certainly is true that on Long Island, because we are so racially segregated residentially, that has created schools that are also racially segregated. Erase Racism does work on both issues, education and also housing. And so housing discrimination is alive and well here on Long Island. I hope that most people have had an opportunity to see the report that was released by Newsday in 2019. If not, go to their website. You don't have to be a subscriber, newsday.com. And you can see in that 3-year investigation, 49% of the Black testers, African-American testers, were received unequal treatment, as did 39% for the Latinx and 19% for Asians. So, and of course, we are aware of this because of some lawsuits that we had and working on this issue for a long time. So the only thing that I can say is that there is some good news too, and I'd like to put that in when it's possible. A series of good news. The most recent is that the New York State Senate and the Assembly passed 7 bills that address different aspects of fair housing. It only needs to get signed by the governor now. So if you want to do something, you can send a note to the governor asking her to sign those 7 bills. And, you know, we are obviously working on that as well. But the other thing that people can do in their own communities include being open to multifamily housing with affordable housing as a component of that. Sometimes it's not all affordable housing, it's a combination of market and affordable. We do not have, actually Long Island has the lowest percentage of multifamily rental housing of any of the surrounding areas, you know, Connecticut, Westchester, of course, New York City, New Jersey, et cetera. And there is often a lot of opposition when developments are trying to get built. And so people can be supportive by showing up in their community, letting your elected officials know that there are some people who do support that. Because if we don't increase the pipeline, then people will not be able to find housing anyway. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Elaine.
You're welcome.
I'd like to throw this one at Lorna, if you don't mind. How can we help teachers address, and it comes from Sarah Siddiqui, how can we help teachers address certain questions that come up from anti-DEI parents so the teachers feel supported by the administration?
Oh, that's a very important question. I think that discussion has to occur with the administration. Because, and again, if there's a board goal with regard to DEI, they would, then the administrators would feel supported. So it starts from the top, but if you have the board goals, then the administration would feel supported and the teachers would be as well. I think that you need to have a discussion from the board level to the administrators with the teachers as to how the resources, providing the resources, the professional development that is there. Because in this charged environment, I can understand why teachers would feel a bit tenuous about even trying to reflect accurate history in their social studies classes, or when there's an issue that is occurring, you know, something like a George Floyd, people might be afraid to discuss it in their classrooms if the discussion has not occurred in the building or with the board. The conversation has to get started within the building, so that teachers feel not only safe, but that they have the resources to provide the parents. It's a tough world that we're living in. I see my colleagues struggling with it. I see teachers being afraid to even mention the word slavery, to mention Jim Crow, to mention, they're afraid because they're afraid that you'll have people at your board meetings attacking you. And it's what I said before, is that we almost are being asked to do a la carte history. We'll only do the history that makes us feel good. But we just did 9/11. That's not something that we feel good about. We don't feel good that somebody attacked our country. Do we not include it? It's a very difficult day that we just remembered 20 years ago. But I can't imagine any classroom that's not speaking about that. I don't know why we feel that not having accurate history included in our conversations in social studies classes, in our literature, why we would feel that that is the way we should be. We weren't like that 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we taught our history. Slavery was something that we talked. Who would ever think about having a social studies class, a US history, and not include the Civil War and the reasons we went into the Civil War, and to talk about Jim Crow and the era when Black people were not allowed to vote, or women weren't allowed to vote. These are all critical points in our history that is very much the foundation of America, where we were and where we ought to be going. So I think we need to realize that we need to have accurate history in our classrooms and accurate literature, and we need to recognize the contributions of a whole host of people. And it is required that we do that in order to be a healthier, safer environment in our schools. But it is a very difficult. I have never experienced such an unsafe environment in my whole life. It is. And I am so happy that we're having this discussion, because we need to begin to infuse that sense of security and safety back in our discussion. So I don't think I've answered with a resource, but I think that we need to begin the conversation to develop the resources that would help teachers to feel that they could answer that question.
Thank you very much. Before I ask the next question, I'd like to ask Phill Andrews if he's heard anything you'd like to comment on.
Oh, I think it's been a lot of great information. I'm really excited about the conversation. I think we're making tremendous progress, and it's going to take work. And I think the very premise of this country is to become a more perfect union, and diversity and equity and inclusion is certainly included in the United States becoming a more perfect union.
Thank you very much, Phill. I'd like to direct the next question to Dan. A questioner named Mark Jacket would like you to elaborate on the racial literacy program for 11th and 12th graders.
Sure. Just to be clear, it wasn't explained 100% accurately at the beginning. It's not a 2-year program. It's a half-year course that's open to 11th and 12th graders that we started this year. So the course essentially is designed to help students gain an understanding and gain knowledge about race as it's been constructed in the United States and around the world. The curriculum is designed to have students develop an awareness of their own racial socialization and skills for engaging in productive conversations about race, racism, and social justice. We'll use readings from a variety of social sciences, history, psychology, political science, sociology. We'll use works of fiction, nonfiction, primary documents, historical documents, current events. just a myriad of forms of media. And they'll all serve as talking points for classroom conversation. They'll engage in some research, they'll do presentations, all with the hope of just sort of giving them a different exposure, a different perspective on the topic of race. So the course is open to juniors and seniors, and it's a half-year course that we started this year. So it's only been a few weeks. So I'm waiting to speak with the teacher probably at the halfway point of the quarter, see how things are going. But I thought we thought as a school, we thought as a department for social studies, that it was something important to kind of dip our toe in and see where it goes. And I'm hopeful that it sustains, and we can further develop coursework in this particular area. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, sir. And the next one is for Michael. Regarding the code of conduct being rewritten in the Port Washington School District, and it comes from Shireen Rashid, who says, right now the DASA bylaws that inform the school's code are not on the website, nor is it translated into the many languages the students and parents speak. When students are under suspension or related incidences of alleged bullying, a lot of times these students and their parents don't seem to have rights or have access to what is available to them. Could you comment on that?
Sure. Listen, the last thing I want to do is to get into a discussion about hyper-generalizing certain incidents or things that one may perceive to take place. I think if we look at the code of conduct as a whole, it needs to change, DASA or not. As far as the bylaws being on our website, there are a lot of things that are on our website, unfortunately, that need to be, and we're addressing that. Our website is something that needs to be upgraded yesterday. So we are on top of that for sure. I think the biggest, well, actually, let me talk about the language access piece as far as translating it. Any document that we have, or it should be most documents, you should be able to translate that with Google Translate on our website. So that should not be a problem, but I will look into that tomorrow for sure, with making sure that we have over 41 languages that are spoken in Port Washington, and we want to make sure from a language access standpoint that's addressed for sure.
Thank you very much.
Yep. No, absolutely. I was going to keep going, but I'm going to stop just because there are lots of other questions.
Question from someone identified as RS. I don't know, maybe Lorna would like to address this one, or perhaps Shoshanna. We haven't heard from her either, or both of you. How should schools address inclusion with respect to social activities? What accommodations are reasonable to expect if social activities are scheduled on a date that is a religious holiday for some, and students who observe it would not be able to attend? So this is Shoshanna or Lorna.
I tried to answer that in the chat. I think more and more schools are looking at their calendars to include some of the main religions as holidays or staff development days, so that students, I know our calendars right now are built around the Jewish calendar. So we know that when Rosh Hashanah, nobody questions whether Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur occurs, that is included. But now we're building out more of those. But no matter how we do it, there are other holidays. Because, for example, this week we had several very conservative Jewish families that are, or teachers who are out because they have some of the what we considered minor holidays for us, but for them it's major. I think that what we have, I can speak to Malverne, the expectation is that work is posted up so that students are able to access the work that was done. I don't know how you would, for social activity, I'm not sure. So something like most homecoming games are on Saturday. If you are really observant, whether you're a Seventh-day Adventist or you are Jewish and you're very observant, you're going to miss homecoming. And I don't know how you make that up. I have no ideas about that, but I do know that in terms of the actual classwork, we have an obligation to post up work and then have access to any kind of extra help that may be needed to help the students understand. But as to social activities that occur once, singular events, a play, a homecoming, a football game or soccer game, I don't know how you would, with all of the activities and calendars that we have to have, how you would do that. I have no idea how to do the social activities.
Thank you.
I'll piggyback off of that real quick. I think that at the university level, like at Stony Brook, where we have such a diverse population, we actually don't have days off for any holidays at this point. I think because we were realizing that when we were built on this Judeo-Christian calendar, we have a large Asian population, an Indian population, and there were a lot of holidays that we were not really giving any credence to. So now, if someone needs to miss for a holiday, there's no penalizing of the academic work. The social activity piece, like Dr. Lewis said, is certainly an issue, but I do think that in most long-term activities, there's more than one thing. You know what I mean? Like, if you miss in my class, if you miss a rehearsal, doesn't mean you're going to be excluded from the concert. So I think it will require flexibility from the people who are advising these like clubs or, like performance-based things, to give a little bit of wiggle room and to realize that there's a whole lot of religions we don't necessarily know every holiday, and to give our students some grace on those issues.
Thank you. Now, the next one I think I'm going to direct to Dan from Jennifer Delahunt. Do you feel the increase of angry community members and agitators at school board meetings against masks and vaccines is a cover to get people involved in an anti-DEI movement? And if so, how can we combat this behavior when some school boards and superintendents do not take a hard stand against these groups and loud, hostile community members?
If it's okay with you, Jim, I'd rather defer that to someone who's to the superintendents on the panel. I think they might be more better equipped to answer that particular question.
Lorna or Michael?
Yeah. Do you want me to start that, Lorna, and then maybe we can tag team it? Or?
Yeah, we'll do that together.
Right.
I don't want to judge people's motive. I do know that the current climate that we have established it is anti everything. We have created a climate where people want what they want. So whether it's vaccines, whether it's masks, whether it's critical race theory, people are we have a level of anger and a sense of entitlement in our communities that people feel that they pay good taxes, and they do. And so therefore their voice should be heard. I mean, there's not this sense of civil engagement that we used to have. There is a sense of I'm entitled, and so no matter what. So I don't think it's masking. I think I don't want my child to feel uncomfortable. I don't want my child to feel in any way that this is a difficult world. I don't want, I used to describe this as we have parents who are lawnmower parents, they pave the way so that their children never fall. And so there is that entitlement, and there's this anything that makes me struggle. But I just want to say to the parents out there, it is in the struggle that we really grow. And so if we could just back off a little bit and be civil in our conversations, have our points heard, I think we might get to a more productive end.
Thank you, Lorna. This is a tough one. And I think rather than put one of the administrators on the spot, I'll ask Elaine to tackle it. It's from Bev Hugh. If, as proponents of DEI and CRT maintain, race and gender are social constructs, how can you facilitate and realize diversity in hiring based on race and gender? How do you achieve equity in an outcome without completely sacrificing the pursuit of academic excellence?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, and I'm not 100% sure on this point, it seems by the last part of the statement that there's some doubt that you can pursue academic excellence and include diversity. And I believe they talked about racial and gender diversity. And I would just say that I disagree on that point. I think that you can do both.
Thank you. Now, for one of the three administrators, if I may, generally speaking, what is being done to increase the supply of non-white teachers and educators? From Steve Vitoff. For Michael, Dan, or Lorna.
Well, I know in Great Neck, we started having the conversation last year in looking at hiring practices. I think that's really where it starts. One of the conversations that I had participated in a different venue was that the criteria by which schools screen candidates needs to be looked at. The question becomes, does a candidate check certain boxes? And, do you see, or can you find candidates that potentially can grow with guidance and support, and to hopefully enhance the diversity of teaching staff? So it's a question, I think, of where we look for candidates. I think it's a question of the criteria that we set for interviewing. And I think that maybe the education system, and not necessarily individual districts, maybe just the system as a whole, needs to reflect on how to attract candidates of diverse backgrounds. I think more than just putting in our ads that diverse candidates are highly encouraged to apply, we need to be more active, I think, in seeking people out for these positions. I don't think we can assume that they're going to come to us. I think people in general will do their homework about districts. And maybe they look at the statistics and the breakdown of that particular staff in those schools and say, well, it's not a diverse staff. I don't want to even apply there. So there's a lot of factors here. But I think starting with sort of review, maybe doing an equity audit. I know that there are organizations and colleges on the island. I think Dr. Hynes in Port Washington may have looked at that as well, in doing an audit of our practices and seeing the things that we could potentially do to attract more diverse candidates.
Thank you. I have one again for Elaine, if I may, because I don't want to put the administrator's feet to the fire on every question. How do you see the New York State Education Department addressing districts that are setting forth policies which clearly go against the new learning standards? It would seem that schools that take this stance do not face any state pushback.
So I should first of all say that I have no inside knowledge about what the New York State Regents and NYSED intend to do. But I would hope that that is something they are going to address. And we have to see, obviously, we've all spoken in one way or another about the seriousness of what they're doing. And so we have to wait and see how they follow through with this.
Thank you. And I think now that it's a little bit after 9:15 and we're thinking about wrapping up, but I have one more that I'd like to hear a comment from the three administrators on, please. From Tanisha George. When discussing DEI in school, I've heard a lot about the education, but what about the policies that continue to negatively impact Black and Latinx students? How do we reduce absenteeism? How do educators dismantle the school to prison pipeline?
So Jim, if it's okay, Lorna, I'll be quick, and then maybe you can hop aboard. One of the things that's part of the reason what we're doing in Port Washington is to really figure that out. You have to do a forensic audit, and I said this in Newsday a couple of weeks ago, of the system as far as the way it operates, and look at its operating system and how everything is interconnected with one another. And you have to take a multi-pronged approach to this. I love what New York City does. They have a community schools model where you're working with outside agencies to work with the community from within, inside the school community. And one of the things we've done is we just created a school liaison, community liaison, social worker, working with our parents who I believe have been marginalized, and to give them the proper resources so they can be successful. But you need a plan. You need to budget for that plan. You need to make it a priority, or else you're going to keep rinsing and repeating and get the same thing over and over again. So that's why, as Lorna said before, you have these board goals, and you make those goals, you create a plan, you create a strategic plan that you share with everybody so they know from the get-go, this is your North Star. This is what you're doing. And you can't do it in pieces. You have to do it, I think, collectively. And it takes a while, but it can't take too long. This can't take 25 years, so you need to do this. It's like, you have to have short-term and long-term goals, but it can be done if that's what the school community wants. And I think most of us do, and it should be all of us.
Thank you. Dan or Lorna?
So one of the things that I'm so pleased to have discovered at Malverne is that intention to address this. I think about 8 years ago, Dr. Romana, who's the principal of the high school, when he came there, the suspension rates were extremely high. The performance of the school was not where it should be. And he has gone around and really changed the culture of the high school, with also the middle school principals, with restorative practices and helping our teachers to understand the different behaviors of our Black and Brown kids. We have 78% Black and Brown students. And by the way, we had a graduating class of 130 students. We're a small district. 65 of those students were AP scholars. This is a high performing district with 78% Black and Brown students and 50% free and reduced lunch. Very, very reduced suspension rates. We did it with our social workers. We did it with our guidance counselors. We did it working in partnership with our parents. We have parent academies. We really have to put the work in. And this all, as Mike reminded us, the board established that expectation. They established an expectation of restorative practices, diminished suspensions, and we go after attendance in a very aggressive manner. If a student isn't in school, we go to their home. We don't wait for them to come back and ask them why they weren't in school. So it's a very hands-on approach. It's an approach that says, you weren't here and it mattered. You gotta let kids know that they matter. Their absence matters. We used to have, this is an example, homecoming, where you'd have the pep rally and the kids disappear. And just last week, my principal said to me, you know, these kids don't want to leave the school anymore because what's happening in the school includes them. This is their home. This is where they belong. And that's the culture and climate that Malverne has. We need to have that in all our schools, that kids know when they come into our schools, they matter. So that's it.
Thank you. Dan?
I think Lorna and Mike covered it. I'm good.
Okay. I'm told that some information will be scrolling or has scrolled about how to contact participants in this panel, and that a recording will be available shortly. So you can check our website at UUCSR/DEI. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for participating, including the Erase Racism President Elaine Gross, and thank her especially for allowing us to use her offices to run the event, because the Shelter Rock Church has not fully reopened yet due to the pandemic. And I'd also like to especially thank Erase community educator and organizer Nicole Grennan and Shelter Rock social justice coordinator Claire DeRoche for their logistical and technical support. And I'd like to thank Shelter Rock communications coordinator Jen Sapel for creating the wonderful ads and our publicity releases and helping with the slides. And now I'd like to ask Reverend Linda Anderson to give us some closing words, please.
A lot of words have been said, a lot of ideas and information has been put forward. And my closing words are, Rest now. Take a breath and rest and let this settle. And tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon, we can all go forward and make our school districts brave spaces for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you to everyone. It's been a wonderfully informative and inspiring program.
Thank you very much, folks, and good night.
Good night.